Welcome to the Resilience Advantage, a series brought to you by the U.S. Resiliency Council and Optimum Seismic. I'm your host, Evan Reese, and we'll be exploring what resilience means to our communities in the face of natural disasters like earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, wildfire, and now even pandemics. Natural disasters can have a devastating effect on vulnerable buildings and vulnerable populations. In this episode, you will learn about which types of buildings are vulnerable, and how and why everyone, not just owners, need to deal with this problem. You'll see how performance-based design and building rating systems are two important tools that are being used to improve building resilience, and how owners can use these techniques to enhance and protect their assets. Leaders in the public and private sector will share their perspectives on why investing in resilience for the long term is not just a good idea, but good business too. Our first two experts are about to explain what modern codes mean for earthquake performance and why it may surprise you that common engineering practice is not to design earthquake or disaster-proof buildings. Ron Mays is one of the co-founders of the U.S. Resiliency Council. He's also originally from New Zealand, which experienced two very large earthquakes a decade ago. Ron, tell us about the lessons learned from these events.
Sure, Evan. There were actually two earthquakes. There was one in September of 2010, a magnitude 7.1 earthquake, which was about 20 miles outside of the central business district of Christchurch, one of the third major city in New Zealand. And then in February 2011, there was a magnitude 6.3 earthquake that was actually centered right underneath the central business district of Christchurch. And that caused a tremendous amount of damage and disruption to the city. However, only two buildings collapsed, but 70% of the buildings in the central business district had to be demolished after the earthquake.
Was this a success? How did engineers evaluate the success of the performance of buildings in these earthquakes?
Well, therein lies the fault of our profession, the structural engineering profession. Our building codes, the commentary to the building codes are very, very clear that they are based on life safety. They're to produce life safety, and in fact, they do a pretty good job at that. But they accept there will be damage to the contents, the mechanical, electrical, architectural components. What we as a profession up until that time had not done was to inform the public that that was the performance that we were delivering. The New Zealand building codes, the New Zealand construction industry are very similar to the US. And so that is a forewarning to what's going to go on in our major West Coast cities. In fact, it's even worse than that because 95% of the buildings in Christchurch had earthquake insurance. So from an economic perspective, they were much better off economically because they were able to collect earthquake insurance. In San Francisco and Los Angeles, less than 20% of the buildings have earthquake insurance.
Building codes are typically a minimum criteria that have, up until now, represented a necessary balance between occupancy and cost.
Hi, I'm Jim Malley, a senior principal with Degenkolb Engineers in San Francisco. So building codes, really, you should think of them as being part of a law because they're part of California statute. As part of the law, we are required as engineers to design them, and contractors are required to build them in accordance with the building code. That really is created for life safety purposes and really to make sure that we have as good a construction throughout the state as possible.
But what about older buildings, not designed and built to modern codes? In cities like San Francisco or Los Angeles, as many as 90% of the building stock was actually built before the institution of modern building codes. Can you imagine if, like in Christchurch, an earthquake in San Francisco or Los Angeles left 70% of the buildings so badly damaged that they had to be torn down? What would those cities look like? Jim Malley can tick off some of the worst building construction features as revealed in past events.
Many of those were built in the 50s and 60s, maybe into the 70s. Our engineers at the time learned that unreinforced masonry buildings were not going to be good performers in earthquakes. Many of them collapsed, caused a lot of the damage as well as the deaths and injuries in that earthquake. If you jump forward to the 1971 San Fernando earthquake in Southern California, that really highlighted the vulnerability of a class of reinforced concrete buildings that had been built in the 1950s and 60s, what we call non-ductile concrete. And really that's the type of concrete that doesn't hold together and doesn't have the ability to flex in an earthquake. It more like shatters. Jump forward to the 1994 Northridge earthquake in Los Angeles. We learned lessons there about steel buildings, steel moment frame buildings, as well as what we call tuck under parking or soft story construction, and also reconfirmed a type of construction we call tilt up construction, where we have concrete walls and wood roofs. You think of your large office park type of areas where those have a lot of damage in that earthquake.
When it comes to our vulnerable buildings, there's often an intersection with our most vulnerable populations, especially around housing. Patrick Ottolini is a project manager at Swinnerton Builders and the former Chief Resilience Officer of the City and County of San Francisco. Patrick, do we have vulnerable housing stock in San Francisco?
Well, San Francisco's housing stock has largely been untested in terms of a seismic event since the 1906 earthquake. We've built up our entire city, about 150,000 buildings, in a period where we haven't experienced a major earthquake.
How would a repeat of the 1906 earthquake affect San Francisco's neighborhood populations, given that there are so many vulnerable buildings in the city?
If you think about this on a citywide scale, you could take the homes of 120,000 San Franciscans that suddenly become homeless overnight because their buildings have collapsed. Well, then what does that do for our system when we try to recover? Those are people that are not going to come back to San Francisco. People already live hand to mouth, paycheck to paycheck here. And so when people have to be displaced because of a disaster, the chances of them coming back are slim to none. And it really changes the way our city looks. So we really need to be thinking about making sure we preserve our urban fabric, keep our people in San Francisco, and create a plan for them to return home after a disaster.
Cheryl Rabinovich has been working in the field of disaster policy and preparedness for about 20 years. Her expertise is in how human behavior and organizational behavior translates into how do we prepare for disasters. Cheryl, why is it so hard sometimes to change public perception, to change public policy, to make resilience something that is a priority?
You know, there's something fundamentally challenging about being ready for natural disasters. They happen in human history on a longer time scale than we're used to managing. Now, pandemics work the same as earthquakes, work the same as floods. We go through this cycle again and again of preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery. The worst thing after a disaster is knowing what you should have done and didn't do beforehand in order to lessen its impact. And we're feeling that with COVID right now. We know the science was out there, we know the technology was out there to be better prepared, and we're feeling those consequences. That's going to be the same in an earthquake situation.
Ultimately, it comes down to whether we are able to have a long-term perspective on the value of protecting our communities. But that is not always an easy thing to do.
So getting people to think about long-term strategies is a very difficult thing. And it's a very hard thing to get leadership to be able to push forward ordinances or requirements for retrofits because of this reason. Now, putting good science in front of these leaders, showing them the situation about the potential damage, about what our recovery looks like, about what our displaced resident count would look like, that starts to get the attention of people. Because one thing we know is disasters make existing societal problems worse. Whether that's a pandemic, whether that's a flood, whether that's an earthquake, whether that's a terrorist attack, these things show us how fragile our communities actually are.
This is the fundamental question we, as a society, have to face. Are we willing to invest now to prevent a greater loss later? Unquestionably, the current pandemic has forced us all to think deeply about this question. The consequences of not being prepared, when, not if, a major event strikes, are going to be profound. But if we take a strategic approach that focuses on our highest risks, we can make positive change.
A lot of people worry, we can't prepare for everything. We can't reduce every building's risk to an absolute minimum. We wouldn't be able to afford it. If we spent all of our household budgets on emergency readiness backpacks, that's money we're not going to spend on books for school. But the way to get around that is to understand our key points of vulnerability and invest there. So with earthquakes, we know what kinds of buildings are highest at risk. We can target our public policies, our incentive programs around getting those buildings up to par. And that way we're also protecting vulnerable populations who are often the ones who are inside those buildings.
Over the past 20+ years, structural engineers have learned an enormous amount about what makes our buildings perform well in earthquakes. Coupled with ever more advanced computing resources and testing capabilities, a new method of building design called performance-based design has enabled engineers to improve the behavior of our new and older buildings beyond what was expected from our building codes.
So our building code right now is basically has what you kind of call, you either conform with the building code or you don't. It doesn't really target specifically the design of the building. So performance-based design really does a much better job of that. It requires a much more elaborate analysis that actually tests the performance and tests the behavior of the structure to various earthquake demands from different ground motions, different hazard levels, different intensities of ground motions. And we really feel much more confident about our understanding of the behavior of those buildings that have gone through a performance-based design type process.
Performance-based design allows engineers, lenders, communities, and other stakeholders to recognize the value of investing in our buildings today to maintain them as functioning assets when they are needed most, after a natural disaster. In the same way that building codes have incorporated green design, they also need to start including resilience. Sophisticated building owners are now seeing the value and starting to reap the rewards of investing in both sustainability and resilience. Michelle Jones is a senior principal at RIM Architects in San Francisco. Michelle, the architectural industry has long championed green design. So what is the profession doing to promote more resilience-based design?
We're seeing that a focus on resiliency is really complementary to what we're already doing with LEED, and it's also becoming prevalent in how our clients are looking at their projects, how they design spaces to connect with their people, to support their people, be able to operate their businesses, and be able to respond in case there is some type of a catastrophic event.
Engineers and architectural professionals are finding that conversations around resilience are easier to have with their clients, many of whom are acutely aware of the potential risks that natural hazards face for their buildings, companies, and communities.
We are seeing that many of our government clients are becoming more knowledgeable on resiliency. We're trying to make our clients a little more knowledgeable on that at the onset of our projects and create that familiarity, and then also trying to help them understand what costs are associated with this. That's always a very important question for our clients.
The U.S. Resiliency Council rose up out of the need to expand from sustainability to also include disaster resilience. Its mission is to provide stakeholders with the information they need to make objective financial decisions about the design, retrofit, purchase, lease, and risk management of their building stock. The USRC brought together many of the nation's leading experts in earthquake design, including more than 40 engineering companies and all the major earthquake professional organizations, to translate performance-based design research and standards into a credible, consistent, and meaningful rating system for building performance in earthquakes.
Rating systems are extremely important. They convey to the public what these buildings actually do in a natural disaster. So knowing that the U.S. Resiliency Council is actively looking at buildings and putting placards on there, so when you walk in, you know that this building is safe. It's very similar to the same public information that we did when we started seeing green buildings, and you'd see a LEED silver or a LEED gold placard, and you thought, oh, they thought about sustainability as you walk in that door. It's no different with the U.S. Resiliency Council when we talk about public information. These are powerful tools, and rating systems are incredibly important so we really understand the life cycle and the risks that are associated with the structures that we see every single day.
The USRC has issued 65 ratings to date and is on track to reach 100 ratings by the end of the year, 6 years after the development of the earthquake rating system began. For perspective, it took the U.S. Green Buildings Council nearly 12 years to issue its 100th LEED rating. Every year, cities around the globe suffer billion-dollar-plus natural disasters. It becomes clear that it is not sufficient to design green. We must design resiliently as well. Leaders in design, construction, and development are recognizing this imperative and acting. The first USRC gold-rated building in San Francisco was a new office space at 85 Bluxom Street, designed by RIM architects and ZFA structural engineers.
It's highly marketable. I think that the type of tenant that is interested in leasing space in buildings in San Francisco are very savvy. They're looking for LEED certified buildings. Certified is another program for creating wellness in interior spaces. And then the USRC, our developer owner, was absolutely ecstatic to be able to add that to the mix. And so now he has an asset which he intends to hold for years and years that is very easily marketable. And in comparison to other assets or other projects that tenants can lease, this project is going to stand out as compared to others.
Rating systems like those developed by the USRC give architectural, engineering, and construction industry professionals more ways to provide value to their clients in an ever more competitive marketplace. Michelle, what can the architecture profession do in general to be more prepared to give their clients good information about resilience?
The U.S. Resiliency Council is doing a great job of educating our industry within various markets on what it means from a structural resilient perspective. I think working through our industries like DBIA, AIA, other organizations that are a part of the AEC industry, bringing this concept to the surface so that more design professionals, contractors, design builders, developers, owners, they all can get educated, and it's really about spreading the word. And if we wait till 20 or 30 years out, it's going to be too late. So I think the time is now to start educating and starting to inform our owners of this, and it'll build up momentum.
One of the ways we can increase demand for more resilient buildings is to offer meaningful financial incentives to owners who invest in better performance, both for new buildings and existing ones.
If we're talking about retrofitting older steel moment frame buildings or non-ductile concrete buildings, then you start to look at a real situation where the cost of that retrofit might negate the value of the building. You might not be able to do it. It might not pencil after that. So thinking about how you approach it, and again, from a policy standpoint, making sure that you give these owners tools, resources, funding mechanisms, whatever that may be, whatever that right intervention is, to be able to make that building safe, that's how we get it done.
In future episodes of the Resilience Advantage, we will be looking in more detail at how to realize the benefits of resilient design and make resilience a good business decision for all stakeholders. Natural hazards are inevitable, but disasters do not have to be. Successes are being achieved every day by engineers, builders, and private and public sector leaders who are making our communities more resilient. The U.S. Resiliency Council and its partners are realizing the vision of a world where we not only have a low impact on the environment has a low impact on us. What we build now, how we build now, will be with us for decades to come. Thank you, and please join us next time on the Resilience Advantage.